The root word is terre, which means to frighten with an overwhelming fear. And if you put the prefix de in front of it, you get to frighten from carrying out acts. It involves emotions as well, of self-preservation, preservation of regimes, preservations of countries.
Deterrence really rests on a strategy of war prevention, not a strategy of war fighting.
The main purpose of the nuclear deterrent is to put an exclamation point on the end of the sentence that says, if you do bad things to us, we will do even worse things to you, so you'd better not do it in the first place. I think where the nuclear weapon made its biggest difference in history was in Europe during the Cold War.
NSC 162/2 had formalized the concept of nuclear deterrence and extended that deterrent to Western Europe. Eisenhower's challenge was to communicate this policy to the Soviets, the NATO allies, and to the American public. Secretary of State Dulles delivered an address to the Council on Foreign Relations in January 1954, publicly announcing the administration's new national security policy that would depend primarily upon a great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our choosing.
Massive retaliation, the way Dulles and Eisenhower used it, in a way was a suicide pact. It said, if the Russians invade Western Europe, we're going to hit back with everything we have. We're not going to waste a lot of resources on trying to build tank defenses against tanks.
And there's been no other time, I think, the U.S. has ever believed that to an overwhelming conventional capability, its only response was to escalate to the use of nuclear.
The resulting controversy took Dulles and the president by surprise.
People were very skeptical about Dulles's announcement, about basically the credibility of the announcement, that it was just not believable that if there was going to be some incursion in what was then called French Indochina with communist forces, would the United States would it really be plausible that the United States would use nuclear weapons on its bombers and destroy Moscow? It just seemed such a disproportionate response.
The introduction of nuclear weapons to deal with every possible contingency certainly struck me, and I think a lot of other people, as just being horrendous.
There were several reasons for the criticism, but the most important was that unless the Soviets or the Warsaw Pact launched a massive attack, it did not seem to justify a massive response on our part.
In 1954, William Kaufman was among an emerging group of civilian strategists who argued that the credibility of retaliation was the key element of deterrence.
There was certainly a problem in the NATO community about the probability that the United States would really let loose its nuclear capabilities in the event of a Soviet invasion.
If the U.S. was there, present in case of any attack, it was bound to be involved because its forces were involved.
But it was not a one-sided affair where we could just blow away some targets, which were never specified, and that there would be no retaliation.
A massive retaliation was not seen by Eisenhower as the panacea for all forms of military conflict. On the contrary, it was addressed primarily to the question of how to prevent or conduct general war if that should be forced upon you.
Eisenhower never really, I think, came seriously close to considering use of nuclear weapons. So he was much more cautious. We had advantages, technology, air power, nuclear weapons, and they were trying to play to our strength. And I think it was fine with him to have in Dulles a pure ideologue, someone who was going to try to scare the hell out of people, That's declaratory policy. Whether it matches employment policy, what you'd actually do, is another matter.
Eisenhower, by betting on massive retaliation, made European economic growth continue longer. Fewer young men had to be in the military. We're all richer today because we took that chance in the 1950s of betting on massive retaliation.
In the early 1950s, much of our deterrent force was based forward. The B-47s, which were based in Morocco, some of them were based in Saudi Arabia, and those were felt to be quite vulnerable.
This was a time when, not long after the Soviet Union had exploded its first nuclear weapon. And the question inevitably came up, well, suppose the Soviet Union were to drop a bomb on these bases, on each of these bases, what would happen?
This question was pondered by researchers at the RAND Corporation. Populated by a unique cadre of top U.S. scientific talent, RAND was perhaps the first defense think tank.
It was a project with a very broad charter, very broad scope, to look at challenges for aeronautics, space, warfare from an Air Force perspective. There was a lot of talented people, some of whom were working on topics that were very relevant to questions of nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy.
One of those people was Albert Wohlstetter, who in 1954 issued a top-secret report warning that SAC's overseas bases were vulnerable to a Soviet first strike.
Albert Wohlstetter led a team at the RAND Corporation that looked closely at worst-case possibilities of could the Soviets catch all of our bombers on the ground and win World War III. And he sort of convinced people that this was a real risk unless major reforms were made in the way SAC, Strategic Air Command, was based and stationed.
Eisenhower's conception was that you might knock out some bases, but you would not knock out enough of the capability altogether so that they were not faced with retaliation.
But the message was always that if one of their bombers gets in and gets over our base, it could destroy the whole base of 50 or 100 bombers, and if they did that enough times, they'd win World War III, and if we do that to them, we win World War III. And that's very nerve-wracking.
Air Force people, remembering the destruction in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor, always felt that if it was important to get in the first blow. If one was coming to war, don't let the enemy get in the first blow.
There's a very deep military logic that would argue for preemption. It's better to get the enemy's forces before they are launched or get you. That's one aspect of preemption. Another is that if your forces are not survivable, there's also a pressure to preempt.
Curtis LeMay once called it anticipatory retaliation. The notion is that war is imminent, it's unavoidable, and you are simply getting the first blow in to be able to destroy an enemy's forces while they're being armed, while they're being fueled.
LeMay was prompted to propose preemption for the same reasons a number of other thinkers were. And that was the realization, correctly, that the only way to limit damage on the United States in a thermonuclear war is to go first.
The most unstable situation is a situation where either side can win depending on who strikes first, and where neither side might want a war, but each side says, I'd rather have the war I start than the war they start.
The Soviet Union, having their forces vulnerable, faced a similar dilemma. They would feel in a major crisis that if they waited for a full American attack, they might not be able to retaliate.
Bomber crews racing out to take off was very exciting to watch, makes great cinema. Very bad for the world political stability. And that makes everybody tense, makes everybody in the mood to strike first when in doubt, and is what we typically would call very low crisis stability or strategic stability.
Soon, Rand would issue a new staff report, anticipating a Soviet first strike with thermonuclear weapons against the SAC bomber force based in the U.S. One proposed solution was to develop the capacity to retaliate after absorbing a full nuclear attack by the Soviets.
The concept of the Second Strike Force was indeed developed at RAND, but it was something that was inherent in the administration once the vulnerabilities of our force became clear.
In April 1954, Eisenhower asked James Killian of MIT to direct a study of how science and technology could address the nation's vulnerabilities.
The Killian report was very important, particularly for the matter of assuring the survivability and the effectiveness of the nuclear deterrent. First, that we must develop missiles as rapidly as possible. The ICBM would be much less vulnerable than was an airfield and a bomber.
A hypothetical Soviet strike at our bases led to an acceleration of the development of our missile programs, both the Minuteman and the Polaris program.
And then came the development to put weapons at sea in the black oceans where they could not be found and attacked.
The Air Force's dominance of strategic delivery had sidelined the Navy in the late 1940s, but had not left it idle.
A new naval era dawns with the launching of the Nautilus, one of the largest submarines ever built.
The world's first nuclear-powered submarine was launched in January 1954. The Nautilus was significant not only for its naval engineering, but also for the relentless efforts of Admiral Hyman Rickover to establish a nuclear navy. The capability to remain submerged for weeks and months at a time was essential to creating a survivable second strike platform for nuclear weapons. Now the challenge was to launch a missile.
The Navy Polaris program started out with the idea of mounting liquid-fueled missiles of a very large size on the outside of submarine, which is, of course, kind of an abomination to sailors.
This was sort of a shotgun wedding between the Navy and the Army. The Army had the missile, the IRBM Jupiter, and the Navy was given the job of taking that missile, adapting it, and taking it to sea.
At both laboratories, work proceeded on the development of lighter and smaller thermonuclear warheads, specifically with missile delivery in mind. And Livermore decided to see what was the smallest two-stage weapon we felt we could design there in the early 50s.
After a couple of false starts, we at Livermore began to work on ways to reduce the weight of thermonuclear weapons to the point where they could go into modest-sized missiles.
We came up with an idea which I then presented to the Atomic Energy Commission. We can get a megaton in 600 pounds. Now that was an exaggeration, but we were serious about it.
And that's a huge change. And since the payload weight pretty much drives the size of a missile that's going to carry it, that offered the prospects that we could have a small missile, hopefully solid propelled, that could fit into a submarine hull.
The Polaris submarine was developed in 1960, ahead of schedule. That doesn't happen too often in the development of military weapons. And I've often said Admiral Rayburn deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for getting it out there when he did, because it took an awful lot of attention, an awful lot of the anxiety out of the nuclear confrontation.
With Polaris, the president was free to make a deliberate decision. If in the event of an assault, he could wait and make certain that exactly what was needed and when.
A ballistic missile submarine changed strategic policy because it became, in the early days, the embodiment of the notion of counter value rather than counter force.
And definitely those missiles were counter-value missiles. Somebody once asked Admiral Rayburn whether a missile fired from the ocean would be accurate enough. And his answer was, if it even hits dry land, it's accurate enough. And what he really meant was, I'm not aiming at a military target, I'm not pretending to be accurate, I'm just imposing damage on the other side, and they know that in advance, and then the war will never happen in the first place.
If you are going to shoot in retaliation at cities, you place a great premium on getting some kind of communication through, but basically you need a very simple message: shoot, don't shoot. And you don't much care how long it takes to get there because you're going to survive.
Key to the viability of Polaris as a deterrent force were improvements in command, control, and communications. Developments in very low-frequency radio technology would provide secure and constant at-sea communication. By 1960, it was clear that Polaris would represent a robust and survivable second strike retaliatory force.
The advent of the strategic submarine certainly brought a new dimension to survivability and clearly has enabled us to have a significant portion of our strategic submarine force at sea in a relatively relaxed posture, but in a survivable posture. And that survivability really enables you to essentially always be able to strike second. And that's really what deterrence is about. It's that responsive capability, not to strike first, but to be able to always strike second.
Arcane debates about strategic vulnerabilities, preserving crisis stability, and survivable nuclear weapons systems like Polaris remained top secret and well out of public view in 1955.
It's Operation Alert 1955.
What stirred the public's imagination was the fear of thermonuclear attack by Soviet bombers.
The intelligence community had the hypothesis that they would build as rapidly as possible. And it was this presupposition of maximum potential output that led to notions about the Balmer Gap.
Returning from the Moscow Air Show in July 1955, Air Force Chief of Staff General Nathan Twining reported seeing scores of new Soviet Bison intercontinental bombers. By 1956, Air Force intelligence, using the presupposition of maximum potential output, predicted that within 5 years, the Soviets could have as many as 800 bombers.
Whole cities could be destroyed by bombs delivered by airplanes. What do? Well, you try to make an air defense. You look to the production of more nuclear weapons, improved nuclear weapons.
I think what's notable is that it was a natural inclination at that time to defend the entire country.
One of the earliest defenses to protect U.S. cities was Nike Ajax, a surface-to-air guided missile system equipped with a conventional high-explosive warhead. By 1958, the Nike Hercules system married a more accurate missile with a nuclear warhead.
We had Nike locations all around the country, very extensive defense systems against aircraft. And so everybody, as a natural instinct, was in favor of defending themselves. When the civil defense program started, that was a natural inclination as well.
The emphasis was essentially on individual citizen action, individual preparation. Civil defense is a component of the doctrine of massive retaliation. On the one hand, we're signaling to the Russians, if you attack us, we will be prepared. We are taking steps to prepare and defend our people. On the other hand, if you attack us, you will experience utter destruction. We will respond massively.
With the White House in the background, Washington is one of scores of cities in the nation's greatest air raid drill.
Throughout the mid-1950s, the nation, together with the president and top government officials, participated in Operation Alert. This nationwide civil defense drill included a top-secret command center in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia.
And there were broadcast facilities there where the president could address the people. And so the idea was continuity of government in the event of the destruction of Washington.
We are here to determine whether or not the government is prepared in time of emergency to continue the functions of government. So there shall be no interruption in the business that must be carried on.
But even as Eisenhower practiced with the nation, he understood that civil defenses and anti-aircraft defenses were no match in a war with thermonuclear weapons. The Atomic Energy Commission began testing deliverable multi-megaton thermonuclear weapons in February 1954. The Bravo test series served to galvanize public attention.
The yield was almost 3 times the most probable value. Unfortunately, the effects of shrimp were felt beyond our proving ground.
The fallout was to the east and relatively heavy for several hundred miles.
The radioactive fallout from those tests was much greater than the scientists had anticipated. With the Bravo test, the issue of radioactive fallout really gripped the public mind.
Eisenhower gave deep thought to the thermonuclear weapon. He began to see it as something going beyond anything that had been experienced in traditional warfare.
I think in the period from the mid-50s through the early 60s, you see a process of gradually increasing public apprehension and awareness.
Eisenhower had a grand conundrum that he was working. How do you talk about national security, and in particular, how do you talk about nuclear weapons issues with the American public, where on the one hand, you're not scaring them to death and saying that everything is so desperate that it's impossible, but on the other hand, you're not sugarcoating it or just not talking about it.
The great chore you have here is to give people the facts, show them what they can do, get the federal leadership, get the participation of the states and the municipalities without terrifying people, right?
Through his administration, I think he tried to find that right balance.
We had 3 main instruments for our security: diplomacy, deterrence, and actual defense, actual military operations.
Eisenhower grappled with conflicting intelligence estimates about a bomber gap, a public aroused to the dangers of thermonuclear weapons, and a defense community urging him to spend billions more. His promise of security with solvency led to a reliance upon nuclear weapons for national security. But at the UN, Eisenhower also initiated a diplomatic track to address widespread fears of thermonuclear war.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma.
The Atoms for Peace speech was a step toward attempting to control nuclear technology in a way that it could be used peacefully. I think it was a very good speech and an important initiative, but had little to do with arms control. The Eisenhower administration did not really come to grips with arms control as a policy and a concept until the moratorium, the 1958 nuclear test moratorium. And that was just the beginning, but that was, as I see it anyway, the beginning.
As he worked to assuage public fears about thermonuclear warfare with a new generation of weapons and delivery systems, Eisenhower was about to receive a most unwelcome surprise.
Great observatories, radar devices, telescopes, binoculars, and the naked eye scan the skies. In Russian, the word for satellite is Sputnik, and Sputnik has the voluntary moon watchers working overtime.
The launch of Sputnik atop a Soviet SS-6 ICBM set in motion a series of political and technological forces that would challenge Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation.
The importance of this feat
cannot be underestimated. It brings mankind closer and closer to an actual escape into space.
But it will be some time before either we or the Soviet forces will have long-range missile capacity equal to even a small fraction of the total destructive power of our present bomber force.
President Eisenhower went on television and he explained that this was a tremendous accomplishment of the Soviet system. It showed that they could launch missiles, of course, but it didn't change our basic deterrence.
Eisenhower continued to think that the nuclear confrontation was governing. The damage that would come from that was so apparent and so great that the Soviets were not likely to initiate such a conflict.
Not for 1 minute did Khrushchev want a nuclear war. I think he was perfectly clear that this would be, just devastating. That's what his own scientists were telling him. And I think he thought that Eisenhower believed exactly the same thing. What he thought was going on was a war of nerves.
On the heels of Sputnik came a new report to the president warning of a precipitous Soviet technological advantage, an ICBM capability that could threaten a first strike as early as 1959.
People who had dire views of national security said, of course, the Soviets are ahead. They did a better job with the German engineers. They have more missiles than we. There's a missile gap.
But he said, they haven't told me a thing I haven't been staying awake nights thinking about for these many years.
2 years earlier, the Killian Report had recommended the acceleration of United States missile programs. It also made another equally important proposal, the improvement of U.S. intelligence gathering. This spurred the development of a high-altitude spy plane to monitor Soviet missile deployment.
The U-2 enabled Eisenhower to check areas where they might be producing these weapons and to assure himself that, in fact, they were not in a position yet to manufacture them.
Yet even with the benefit of new intelligence, an improved early warning system, and the promise of survivable retaliatory systems on the horizon, many felt that Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation was losing credibility.
The rapid development of the H-bomb caused a number of American strategists, particularly at RAND, to recognize that this was going to be a two-sided game, ultimately.
It was very uncertain, but you could certainly try to limit those kinds of operations by dealing only with targets that were military targets.
And counterforce arose because a counterforce arose in Russia, so you wanted to try to do something about that. So it became natural to try to target the emerging Soviet nuclear capability.
Nobody could guarantee that if you did counterforce and not counter-city, that it would work out, but it was worth a chance.
There is a dividing line of people in the nuclear age, because some believe that nuclear weapons don't fit this, that nuclear weapons only will produce such massive, horrific destruction that no political objective could be achieved by actually using nuclear weapons. Others believe that they could be if they were used in a calibrated fashion, if they were low yield, if they were proportionate to the aggression.
Eisenhower continued to embrace a policy of deterrence by threatening to inflict unacceptable damage upon the Soviets. A new strategic concept proposed to the president at the National Security Council argued for greater flexibility. But Eisenhower regarded the strategy of graduated retaliation coercion as something akin to fighting with nuclear weapons.
But Eisenhower would have none of it. He was adamantly opposed to the idea of incremental engagement.
Certainly, I think that as an experienced commander from World War II, Eisenhower had little truck with that. The fog of war would just wipe away the nature of the signals you were sending.
All of us know that, whether started deliberately or accidentally, global war will leave civilization in a shambles. This is as true of the Soviet system as of all others. In a nuclear war, there can be no victors, only losers.
Eisenhower was a very complicated man with complicated thoughts, and his view was that if we had a boldly stated position, that was part of deterrence in and of itself.
For Eisenhower, the Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine embodied the very notion of nuclear deterrence, a survivable weapons system that ensured strategic stability. But the deployment of Polaris would create serious new operational challenges. Beginning in the late 1950s, a technological momentum drove the development of U.S. ballistic missile systems. The speed of this growth would overtake national policy and operational planning.
Minuteman I flew on the 63rd of December, 1961. Sam Phillips was a young brigadier general. His bosses had told him, you have to fly this thing in 1961. We were all down at the Cape, and this missile wasn't ready to be flown in 1961. So I said to Sam, look, we'll take this calendar, we'll put it in the blockhouse. We'll extend December till we get the thing flown. So we actually flew it on the 63rd of December. That was Flight Test Missile 401. With that piece of data, we knew the thing would work.
A year before the successful test of Minuteman I, the Navy commissioned Polaris and developed separate targeting plans for their A-1 ballistic missile. A submarine-launched ballistic missile would now greatly complicate the nuclear planning process.
In the late 1950s, you had different commanders, a specified commander, SIGSAC, various unified commanders, EUCOM, PACOM, and so forth, each of them developing their nuclear weapons plans independent of one another.
The theater commanders were identifying targets that the strategic commander also believed needed to be struck, so that you had more than one weapon being applied to a target when perhaps only one or two weapons was necessary.
There was recognition among planners that the interface between deliveries, that the fratricide was likely to ensue.
That we'd be killing our own forces, not just enemy forces. And yet the Air Force and the Navy did not have a capability to disengage their different war plans.
Eisenhower referred to the lack of integration as a monstrosity.
In 1958, General Nathan Twining, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, had proposed improving the nuclear planning process with a joint unified command. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, vigorously opposed the idea and feared losing control of the Navy's Polaris.
General Twining was certainly well aware that to have an effective integrated plan, that he was going to have to make the Navy comfortable with this process. Twining earlier had pushed for some kind of a structured, coherent planning process.
The compromise, if you will, was that each of the forces would control their own delivery systems, but that targeting had to be combined in a joint staff.
On August 11, 1960, Eisenhower formally approved the proposal for the formation of the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff, the JSTPS, envisioned by General Twining.
The decision was taken late in the Eisenhower administration to create this new body out in Omaha, Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff. The first thing that the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff was going to do was put together a single integrated operational plan.
Single integrated operational plan identifies targets it allocates weapons to the targets, and it decides on how those weapons are delivered to those targets. The PSYOP is based upon the written guidance that begins with the President and is refined by the Secretary of Defense and then further elaborated upon by the Joint Staff.
This is an extraordinarily elaborate undertaking, and PSYOP 62 was the first attempt to do that in a very compressed time frame. It was an inflexible plan in the sense that it didn't have a lot of options built into it.
PSYOP 62 appeared to have a number of options. I believe it was 14, but there was no difference. All it was how generated the forces were. So as more forces became generated, you had what looked like a different option.
Each option included all countries in the Sino-Soviet bloc, giving the president virtually no capability to differentiate. Eisenhower himself began to doubt the wisdom of having only large-scale nuclear attack options.
Eisenhower's science advisor went out and took a look at PSYOP 62 when it was being put together and came back and said it's too inflexible. And I think Eisenhower would have agreed in that.
I think it's fair to say that when Kennedy came into office, he and many of his senior civilian advisors were quite shocked to find the kind of war plans that they had inherited from the Eisenhower administration. Indeed, Kennedy was given a memorandum in July 1961 from McGeorge Bundy that said, in essence, the current plan calls for shooting off everything we have in one shot, and it is so constructed as to make any more flexible course very difficult.
The history, again, of nuclear weapons has been the ever-elusive effort to give the President of the United States flexibility in a choice about what attack options, what uses of nuclear weapons he could choose in a crisis.
The significance of the relationship between the civilian policy leadership and the military personnel who implemented that policy into the PSYOP is perhaps the most significant story of the period from 1960 to 1990.
Cold War tensions in West Berlin would launch a search for flexible nuclear options by a new administration. A search that would tap many of the strategic theories about nuclear war which had been percolating at Rand throughout the 1950s.
I think the most serious indictment that I have for this administration is that the relative power of the United States has declined in comparison to the Sino-Soviet bloc.
This administration has not met its responsibilities either at home or abroad.
Our task is to rebuild our strength.
I want the people of the world and Mr. Khrushchev to know that a new generation of Americans has taken leadership of this country, and that this free society speaks with power, force, and decision.
In 1960, John Kennedy campaigned on fears of a missile gap with the Soviets, a gap which later turned out to be more symbol than substance.
The Soviets had paltry forces. At one point, they had only 4 ICBMs. That was not enough for a major attack on the United States.
President Eisenhower offered Kennedy or some of his advisors a view of the highly classified information, but Kennedy and his team declined to have any knowledge, official knowledge of this, and when they got in, discovered that the missile gap was in the other direction, that we didn't have a problem in that way.
Kennedy surrounded himself with what the Joint Chiefs would refer to as the whiz kids, and chief among them was his 44-year-old Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
McNamara recruited from Rand people like Charles Hitch, who became the chief budget figure at the Defense Department, Alan Enthoven, who had an Office of Systems Analysis, Kaufman himself, who had been at Rand. And these were people who applied quantitative methods to solve some of the problems that McNamara wanted solved. And McNamara was a major supporter of these techniques being applied to military problems.
The connection between Rand and the Kennedy administration worked out very well and was very close.
The whiz kids from Rand had new ideas about nuclear strategy and operations, which were unified by the notion that the president should have choices.
When he was briefed initially about the PSYOP, didn't have any choice at all. Kennedy was so furious about this that he said he'd never sit in on any one of these exercises again, and he made it very clear to McNamara that he wanted choices.
One thing that shocked me almost more than anything else about the PSYOP plans that I reviewed in March of 1961 at SAC was we essentially blasted our way through Warsaw Pact countries in order to get to the targets of our PSYOP in the Soviet Union. And I remember, I thought, my God, what are we going to do to Poland?
Moreover, there's no differentiation in those attack plans between attacking nuclear targets, conventional military targets, and urban industrial targets.
McNamara was originally promulgating a no cities strategy. Don't go after the cities, go after the forces, and do it in such a way as to limit the amount of damage. And no point killing people just to kill them. That's not the point of this.
The no cities approach was an attempt to pursue some thoughts that some of the RAND experts had brought with them.
The only way I could see that one could use nuclear weapons but still have some kind of control over the way in which the exchange might evolve was by avoiding cities.
We asked SAC to develop greater flexibility in their programs, their plans, to provide withholding capabilities. I thought it was very important to provide other options to the president.
As a review of planning guidance for nuclear weapons got underway in the summer of 1961, McNamara was briefing the president about a new crisis in West Berlin. By July, the NSC was considering a variety of military responses to a renewed blockade of West Berlin, including the use of nuclear weapons in Central Europe.
The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
One of the most important events was the Soviet attempt to take West Berlin. At the time, of course, West Berlin was isolated from the rest of the NATO, located in East Germany. But about that time, I called the SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, who was General Norstad, back to Washington. And I said, look, Larry, they did A, we did B, they did C, we did D. How's this thing going to evolve?
The flexible response doctrine began when Kennedy and his advisors recognized that the Berlin crisis was dangerous and that the utter lack of flexibility in nuclear war plans made it even more dangerous.
By September 1961, a wall separating West and East Berlin reduced the immediate tensions, but it would stand as an enduring symbol of the Cold War for the next 28 years. After the crisis, McNamara issued his first draft presidential memorandum that provided new guidance for PSYOP 63, which for the first time included a secure reserve force.
What PSYOP 63 was a plan to do was to create lower-level options pre-planned, not to do this thinking on the spot, not to have civilian officials ad-libbing a nuclear war plan.
PSYOP 63 was a plan that included 5 primary attack options, designed to be executed under varying contingencies of preemption or retaliation. The plan allowed for withholding attacks in a number of different ways and focused on the destruction of Soviet forces while maintaining a secure reserve force capable of devastating the Soviet society. PSYOP 63 was the first effort to control the escalation of a nuclear war.
The military tended to object to notions of, let's say, escalation control, withholds, complications to the war plan.
Many military officers, when asked to engage in more limited nuclear options, have withholds to protect Soviet cities in the hope that the Soviet Union would not attack our cities, felt that this was abstract theorizing by American civilians and that they did not want to have any part of it.
Theories of escalation control would also be complicated by rapidly increasing numbers of Soviet strategic nuclear forces capable of inflicting unacceptable damage upon the United States.
So the attempt to avoid that by a publicly discussed policy of limiting damage to each side was considered impractical, and we moved away from it very, very quickly. And we moved away from it to what became known as flexible response.
McNamara shifted from damage limitation to flexible response. A flexible response is basically saying we have to keep our options open. We need what we need to have for lots of different choices, and let's not lock ourselves in to one particular kind of strategy, and let's use the minimum force necessary to achieve our goal.
A flexible response, in a sense, was a withholding strategy. We'd only use a portion of our force, hoping that the Soviets would only use a portion of theirs.
Same kind of thing he endorses today, that nuclear weapons should never be used unless the other side uses them first, that we should endorse a no first use policy. The West European allies we had didn't like that at all.
And the Europeans said, well, you're going to fight a conventional war here and destroy Western Europe with non-nuclear munitions, or we are going to be overrun. That does not sound like a very good deterrent. The Europeans preferred to have at least the public discussion emphasizing nuclear weapons.
And NATO policy, in effect, would be supported by increasing the numbers of both strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons.
Today we have a flexible fighting team ready to deal with any threat, whether it be large or small. We are superior to the communists in nuclear power, and we intend to stay that way.
Indeed, there were 7,000 tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe. McNamara introduced those weapons as a way to reassure the Europeans that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons. I'm not sure that he would ever have used them. That was not his nature, but it was part of a symbol of American support.
Despite my belief, and it was shared by the President Kennedy, that it would be contrary to the interests of the U.S. and NATO to ever initiate the use of nuclear weapons. That was still the publicly stated NATO policy, and it was the policy that underlay NATO's war plans.
Which in some ways is a lot like what was the official policy in the last years of the Eisenhower administration, that we may try to hold you back without using nuclear weapons, but then we may bring nuclear weapons in. It was a policy that was clear as mud, deliberately clear as mud.
In the General Assembly, a vitriolic attack on a Philippine delegate who spoke of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Khrushchev falls to personal insult.
I mean, Khrushchev in this way was like Stalin. He wanted to seem stronger rather than weaker. So this was a pretty high-stakes game of politics, but I think to his mind, nuclear war was just out of the question. So it was this, see who would blink first in a crisis.
Since the heady days of Sputnik, Khrushchev had impressed the West with his claims for Soviet technological prowess. But 5 years later, the Soviet leader grew bolder. In October 1962, the United States had Jupiter missiles on NATO bases in Britain, Italy, and Turkey, and their flight times to targets in the Soviet Union were measured in minutes. In Khrushchev's eyes, the U.S. had altered the strategic balance of power.
One of the explanations for Khrushchev's action in Cuba is to plug the gap in strategic forces by deploying systems that can strike the U.S.
On October 14, a recon plane returns with the first hard photographic evidence indicating the presence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba. Immediately, increased surveillance is ordered.
The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba tested U.S. strategic nuclear policy at a time when it possessed an overwhelming nuclear superiority at a ratio of nearly 17 to 1. Yet the execution of pre-planned nuclear options contained in PSYOP 63 was only remotely considered within EXCOM, the executive committee established by Kennedy to deal with the crisis.
I agreed we had to get them out because they'd been introduced under the cloak of deceit. But I stated we should be clear on one thing. They did not change the military balance.
While all agreed that action was necessary, there was no consensus about the impact of the missiles in Cuba upon the strategic balance. The Joint Chiefs believed that Soviet missiles 100 miles offshore were massively destabilizing.
All of the Western Hemisphere, from Hudson Bay to Lima, Peru, is within their range. With the facts now before him, President Kennedy continues to meet with his top advisors.
And I said, what the hell difference does it make whether a missile is launched from 100 miles off the shore or 5,000 miles off the shore? Before they put those there, you knew damn well that if we launched the first strike, they would launch whatever survived of their force, and we've all agreed that it would be sufficient to deter us from launching a first strike. So before they put those missiles there, we didn't have a first strike capability. But we did have a clear capability to deter. Now, they put those missiles there in Cuba. We still don't have a first strike. It hasn't changed a bit, but we still have a deterrent.
They realized that they were very close to a nuclear war because as they looked at the potential outcomes in the heart of that crisis, they didn't look very good.
The EXCOM never really raised the issue of what do we do with our nuclear forces. The only thing that made them think differently was when I pointed out to them that SAC was moving its forces down within range of the Cuban missiles. And at that point, they began to recognize that this was a military as well as a political issue.
During the 5 or 6 days, we debated two major alternatives. One was a quarantine, and the other was an airstrike, which it was recognized would have to be followed by a sea and land invasion.
As Kennedy reviewed the options one last time, he asked General Sweeney, the operational commander, if an airstrike would destroy all the missiles.
He said, Mr. President, I can guarantee you we will destroy more of those missiles than any other Air Force could. But can I guarantee you there won't be 1, 2, or 5 left? No. Now, at that moment, it was clear in my mind that Kennedy was not going to support the attack. What president would initiate action that almost surely would result in 1, 2, or 5 nuclear warheads detonating on some of his major cities?
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventuality. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response on the Soviet Union.
I think that ultimately it was the sheer horror to McNamara of contemplating a serious nuclear war that led him to back off to the notion of assured destruction as sufficient to hold the Soviet Union at bay.
Now, this had an immense impact on my thinking about the use of nuclear weapons. I have often said publicly, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the best managed foreign policy or defense policy crisis of the last 50 years. But in the end, We avoided nuclear war by the narrowest of margins because of luck. All of this influenced my thinking regarding nuclear strategy, nuclear force levels, and particularly my advice to President Johnson.
So later on, McNamara began to stress the ultimate deterrent, the assured destruction capability, as not just the minimum deterrent, but as the essence of deterrence, because he wanted that to be a constraining force.
After absorbing a Soviet first strike, a U.S. capability of destroying 25 to 30% of their population and 50% of their industrial and military capability.
Then the technical people said 400 megaton weapons on Russian cities and industrial capacity would do the job. So that from then on was the design goal for building forces, to have 400 weapons assured of delivery despite their destruction before launch, despite their possible attrition in going through defenses.
At its peak in 1962, with 283,000 personnel and 3,400 aircraft, SAC exercised considerable influence upon decisions about nuclear force requirements. McNamara's initial guidance, supporting a policy of flexible response, had prompted the JSTPS to identify many more military targets.
Flexible response was driving the inventory. If you wanted to have flexible response, you wanted to have a large number of weapons, you wanted to develop new kinds of weapons.
The Air Force immediately not only rejoiced, but saw the opportunity to expand their capabilities, especially the Minuteman ICBM, and they proposed buying 10,000.
McNamara increasingly, during his tenure in the Pentagon, became consumed with trying to put a lid on the nuclear forces.
For McNamara, assured destruction became a rationale for sizing retaliatory forces of the PSYOP, as well as a declaratory policy of deterrence.
McNamara believed that he would be deterred by the threat of massive retaliation, and he assumed that the Russians would feel the same.
But I think that was a grave misunderstanding of how the Soviet leaders thought about nuclear weapons, and especially about the way in which the military thought about nuclear weapons, which was in terms of fighting a war, and, because that was, in a way, their mission.
They tend to be very tough-minded about these things. They're always interested in much more force than they might ever need. They're very conservative that way. That's their whole history.
And I think that there was a substantial period of time when the Soviet Union built strategic forces for reasons that had to do with internal Soviet politics and internal resource allocations. Nuclear theory and nuclear strategy has made a lot of difference in the way we pointed weapons, but it has not made nearly as much difference as we like to claim in how many weapons we had. And I believe that is almost certainly true for the Soviet Union. Harold Brown once said, "When we build, they build, and when we stop, they build."